The silence in the room was deafening. Every man present knew they were witnessing something that would be talked about for decades. Bumpy Johnson sat perfectly still at the poker table, his dark eyes fixed on the man who had just crossed a line no one should ever cross. The ice in his whiskey hadn't even melted yet, but the temperature in the room had dropped 20 degrees. Vincent the Hammer Torino leaned back in his chair, a smug grin spreading across his face. He thought he was untouchable. After all, he controlled half the docks in Manhattan, had judges in his pocket, and commanded respect from Brooklyn to the Bronx. What could one man from Harlem possibly do to him? "What's wrong, Bumpy?" Vincent laughed, his voice echoing off the walls of the private back room at Rao's restaurant. "Cat got your tongue? Or maybe your mama never taught you how to speak when grown folks are talking?" The other men at the table shifted uncomfortably. They knew Vincent had just made a fatal mistake. You could insult a man's business, his clothes, even his wife if you were feeling particularly bold. But his mother? That was sacred ground. Especially when it came to Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy's fingers drummed once against the green felt table. Just once. The sound was barely audible, but it might as well have been a gunshot. He reached into his jacket pocket, not for a weapon, but for a photograph. Old, worn at the edges, but precious beyond measure, his mother, standing outside their small apartment in Charleston, South Carolina, holding a young Bumpy's hand. "Tell me, Vincent," Bumpy said, his voice so calm it was unsettling. "What do you know about respect?" Vincent's laughter faltered slightly. Something in Bumpy's tone made the hair on the back of his neck stand up, but his pride wouldn't let him back down now, not in front of his own crew. "I know enough to recognize when someone doesn't deserve it," Vincent shot back, gesturing dismissively at Bumpy. "You Harlem boys think you run something, but you're just playing dress-up in suits your betters threw away." The insult hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, but Bumpy didn't explode. He didn't reach for his gun. He didn't even raise his voice. Instead, he did something far more terrifying. He smiled. To understand what happened in that room that night, you need to go back to the beginning. To understand why Vincent Torino would be found 3 weeks later, broken and begging on the steps of St. Patrick's Cathedral, you need to know who Bumpy Johnson really was. Born Ellsworth Johnson in 1905, Bumpy had learned the rules of the street before he could properly tie his shoes. His mother, Margaret Johnson, was a woman who commanded respect through sheer force of character. She cleaned houses for wealthy white families during the day and ran numbers for the local gangsters at night. She taught her son 2 things that would define his entire life. Never forget where you come from and never let anyone disrespect your family. By 1935, Bumpy had become the most feared man in Harlem. Not because he was the loudest or the most violent, but because he was the smartest. While other gangsters fought over street corners, Bumpy built an empire based on loyalty, intelligence, and an unbreakable code of honor. He controlled the numbers racket, the protection schemes, and had politicians from City Hall to Washington, D.C. on his payroll. But more than that, he was a man of the people. When families couldn't make rent, Bumpy paid it. When kids needed school supplies, they appeared. When the police got too aggressive in Harlem, they found themselves transferred to precincts in Staten Island. Vincent Torino, on the other hand, was everything Bumpy despised about the criminal underworld. Born into money, handed power on a silver platter, he ruled through fear and brutality rather than respect and intelligence. He saw Bumpy as nothing more than a street thug who had gotten lucky, a sentiment shared by many of the Italian families who controlled organized crime in New York. But they were about to learn that luck had nothing to do with it. As Bumpy sat there in that back room, Vincent continued his tirade, unaware that he was sealing his own fate with every word. The other men at the table, Jimmy the Fish Marconi, Tony Benedetto, and Sal Numbers Garofalo, watched in fascination and growing horror as their boss dug his own grave. "You're kind," Vincent spat, pointing an accusatory finger at Bumpy. "You come up here from the South thinking you can play with the big boys, but you're still just plantation workers pretending to be kingpins." Bumpy's smile never wavered. In fact, it seemed to grow wider. He carefully placed his mother's photograph back in his jacket pocket, right next to his heart. Then he stood up slowly, smoothing down his perfectly tailored suit. "Vincent," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "you just made the biggest mistake of your life." But what Vincent didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Bumpy hadn't come to that meeting to play cards. He'd come to deliver a message, and the message was already in motion, spreading through the streets of New York like wildfire through dry leaves. The game had changed, and Bumpy Johnson was about to teach everyone exactly what happened when you disrespected the wrong man's mother. Vincent Torino had no idea he was already a dead man walking. In his mind, he had just put an uppity street dealer in his place. The laughter from his crew echoed around the room as he basked in what he believed was his moment of triumph. But the seasoned criminals at that table could sense something different in the air, something dangerous. "You know what your problem is, Johnson?" Vincent continued, emboldened by what he mistook for Bumpy's silence as submission. "You people think you can just waltz into our city and demand respect. But respect is earned, not demanded. And you're nothing but a numbers runner with delusions of grandeur." Bumpy remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back in a pose that would have looked casual to anyone who didn't know better. But Jimmy, the fish Marconi, knew better. He'd been in this business for 30 years, and he recognized the stance of a predator preparing to strike. The way Bumpy's weight was balanced on the balls of his feet. The way his breathing remained steady despite the insults being hurled at him. This wasn't submission, this was calculation. "Tell me something, Vincent," Bumpy said, his voice carrying that same unsettling calm. "How's your nephew doing? Little Anthony? The one who goes to that private school on the Upper East Side?" The color drained from Vincent's face. Nobody was supposed to know about Anthony. The boy was kept deliberately separate from the family business, protected by layers of security and secrecy. How could this Harlem street thug possibly know about him? "Don't you dare!" Vincent started, but Bumpy raised a hand, silencing him with a gesture that somehow carried more authority than any shouted threat. "Relax," Bumpy said, that smile returning to his face. "I'm just making conversation. After all, family is important, isn't it? Speaking of which, how's your sister Maria? Still running that little dress shop in Little Italy? Such a nice lady, always so polite to her customers." Vincent's hand moved instinctively toward the gun in his shoulder holster, but Tony Benedetto grabbed his wrist. The older man had survived 40 years in organized crime, by knowing when to fight and when to listen. Right now, every instinct he'd developed told him to listen very carefully. "You're probably wondering how I know these things," Bumpy continued, beginning to pace slowly around the table. "See, Vincent, while you've been sitting in your little kingdom thinking you're untouchable, I've been doing what smart men do. I've been learning. About you, about your family, about your business operations, about your weaknesses." The room had gone completely silent except for the sound of Bumpy's footsteps on the hardwood floor. With each step, Vincent's confidence crumbled a little more. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. He was Vincent the Hammer Torino. He was the one who made threats. He was the one who held all the cards. "You want to know what I learned?" Bumpy asked, stopping directly behind Vincent's chair. "I learned that you're not nearly as smart as you think you are. I learned that your organization has more holes than a piece of Swiss cheese. And most importantly, I learned that you don't understand the first thing about respect." Vincent twisted in his chair to face Bumpy, his earlier bravado replaced by something that looked suspiciously like fear. "What do you want, Johnson?" "Want?" Bumpy laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. "I don't want anything from you, Vincent. You see, 3 hours ago, when I walked into this room, I already had everything I needed." The implication hung in the air like poison gas. 3 hours ago, before the insults, before the comments about his mother, Bumpy had come here already knowing what was going to happen. But the real terror began when Bumpy reached into his other jacket pocket and pulled out a small recording device. The kind that had become popular among law enforcement agencies. The kind that could capture every word spoken in crystal clear quality. "You know what the beautiful thing about technology is?" Bumpy asked, setting the device on the table where everyone could see it. "It doesn't lie. It doesn't embellish. It just records exactly what happened, exactly as it happened. Vincent's eyes fixed on the device like a man watching his own execution. In that little black box was everything. Every insult, every racial slur, every arrogant boast about his illegal activities. In the wrong hands, that recording could destroy not just him, but his entire operation. Of course, Bumpy continued, this particular recording might be of interest to several people. The FBI, for instance, they've been very curious about your dock operations. Something about skimming money from union pension funds. And then there's District Attorney Morrison. He's been looking for evidence of corruption in the sanitation department. Funny how your name keeps coming up in those investigations. The other men at the table began to understand what they were witnessing. This wasn't a confrontation. It wasn't even a negotiation. This was a chess game that had been over before it began, and they were just now seeing the checkmate. But Bumpy wasn't finished. He walked back to his chair and sat down, pulling out a thick manila envelope. From it, he extracted a series of photographs, black and white images that made Vincent's blood turn to ice. The first photo showed Vincent meeting with known communist sympathizers down at the docks. The second showed him accepting an envelope full of cash from a Soviet agent. The third showed him in what appeared to be a very compromising position with someone who definitely wasn't his wife. You see, Vincent, Bumpy said, spreading the photographs across the table like he was dealing cards. While you've been busy running your mouth about respect, I've been busy earning it. These pictures? They were taken by some very professional people. People who work for me now instead of working for you. The revelation hit Vincent like a physical blow. His own photographers, his own intelligence network had been turned against him. How long had Bumpy been planning this? How long had he been walking into a trap without even knowing it? The interesting thing about evidence, Bumpy continued, his voice never rising above a conversational tone, is that it tells a story. And the story these pictures tell is very different from the one you've been selling to your bosses in Chicago. I wonder what they'd think if they knew you'd been dealing with the Russians behind their backs. Vincent's world was collapsing around him, but the worst part was Bumpy's calm. There was no anger, no satisfaction, no emotion at all. Just the cold, methodical destruction of a man's entire life, delivered with the same tone you might use to discuss the weather. Now, Bumpy said, collecting the photographs and sliding them back into the envelope, we come to the reason I'm really here tonight. He reached into his jacket one final time and pulled out a business card. Expensive paper, embossed lettering. The kind of card that suggested serious money and serious connections. My mother, he said, placing the card on the table between them, taught me that a man's word is his bond. She taught me that respect is the only currency that truly matters, and she taught me that some debts can only be paid in full. Vincent stared at the card, his hands shaking as he read the name printed there. It was a name that made grown men cross themselves and powerful politicians return phone calls immediately. Tomorrow morning, Bumpy said, standing up once again, you're going to receive a visitor, a gentleman who specializes in collecting debts that can't be paid with money. When he arrives, you're going to give him something very specific. The tension in the room was suffocating. Even the sound of breathing seemed too loud. You're going to give him an apology, Bumpy continued. Not to me, to my mother. You're going to explain to him exactly what you said about her tonight, and you're going to beg for her forgiveness. And if that apology isn't sincere enough, if it doesn't come from the very depths of your worthless soul. He left the sentence unfinished, but everyone in the room understood exactly what he meant. Vincent opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. For the first time in his adult life, he was completely powerless. The empire he'd built, the reputation he'd cultivated, the fear he'd inspired, all of it was crumbling like a house of cards in a hurricane. But as Bumpy walked toward the door, he paused and turned back one final time. Oh, and Vincent? He said, that terrifying smile returning to his face. The gentleman you're going to meet tomorrow, he's someone you know very well. And with that, Bumpy Johnson walked out of the room, leaving behind 5 men who were just beginning to understand that they had witnessed something extraordinary. But Vincent Torino wouldn't have long to contemplate his mistakes, because the next morning would bring a visitor that would change everything. They thought they had broken Bumpy Johnson that night. They were wrong. They had only awakened something far more dangerous than they ever could have imagined. Vincent Torino barely slept that night. Every shadow outside his mansion seemed to hide a threat. Every car that passed his gate could be carrying his executioner. He dismissed his usual bodyguards, afraid they might be compromised. After all, if Bumpy had gotten to his photographers, who else had he turned? By dawn, Vincent was pacing his study like a caged animal, nursing his third cup of coffee and his first whiskey of the day. The business card Bumpy had left behind sat on his mahogany desk like a ticking bomb. He'd stared at that name so many times the letters seemed to burn into his retinas. The doorbell rang at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. Vincent's hands shook as he peered through the curtains. A black Cadillac sat in his driveway, engine still running. The driver remained behind the wheel, but a single figure stood at the front door. Tall, impeccably dressed, carrying a leather briefcase that looked expensive enough to feed a family for a year. What made Vincent's blood turn to ice wasn't the man's appearance, it was his face. Because he recognized that face. He'd been staring at it across dinner tables for the past 15 years. It was his own brother-in-law, Marcus Torino. Marcus wasn't just family. He was Vincent's most trusted lieutenant, his right-hand man, the keeper of all his darkest secrets. If Marcus was here on Bumpy's behalf, it meant the betrayal ran deeper than Vincent had ever imagined. "Hello, Vincent," Marcus said when the door finally opened. His voice carried none of the warmth it usually held during family gatherings. "We need to talk." They sat in Vincent's study, the same room where he'd planned countless illegal operations, ordered beatings, and destroyed the lives of anyone who crossed him. Now it felt like a courtroom, and he was very clearly the defendant. "How long?" Vincent asked, his voice barely above a whisper. 3 years, Marcus replied, setting his briefcase on the desk between them. "Ever since you ordered the hit on that reporter, the one who was asking too many questions about our shipping operations." The reporter. Vincent remembered him well. Young, idealistic, the kind of man who believed he could take down the entire Italian mob with nothing but a typewriter and righteous indignation. Vincent had him killed without a second thought. "You didn't know," Marcus continued, "but that reporter was Johnson's nephew, his sister's boy, fresh out of Columbia journalism school, trying to make a name for himself." The revelation hit Vincent like a sledgehammer to the chest. All this time, he'd thought tonight's confrontation was about some casual disrespect. But this wasn't about his crude jokes or racist comments. This was about blood. This was about family. This was about a debt that had been 3 years in the making. "Johnson came to me the night after the funeral," Marcus said, opening his briefcase with deliberate precision. "He didn't threaten me, didn't try to intimidate me. He just sat down and told me exactly what kind of man my brother-in-law really was." From the briefcase, Marcus pulled out a thick folder. Inside were photographs, documents, recorded conversations. 3 years' worth of evidence documenting every crime, every corruption, every moment of Vincent's descent into becoming exactly the kind of monster he'd once sworn he'd never become. "He showed me pictures of that boy," Marcus continued. "Pictures of him growing up, graduation photos, letters he'd written to his mother about wanting to make the world a better place. And then he showed me what you turned him into, what was left after your people finished with him." Vincent's mouth had gone completely dry. He reached for his whiskey, but his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't lift the glass. "The thing about Johnson," Marcus said, "is that he's patient. He could have had you killed that very night, could have started a war that would have torn this city apart. But he wanted something more than revenge. He wanted justice. And justice, real justice, takes time to build properly." The folder contained more than just evidence of Vincent's crimes. It contained a complete map of his entire organization. Names, dates, locations, bank account numbers, shipping schedules, everything the FBI would need to dismantle the Torino crime family brick by brick. But there was something else in that folder. Something that made Vincent's heart stop completely. Letters, in his own handwriting. Letters to Maria, his sister, Marcus's wife. Letters that revealed feelings that went far beyond brotherly affection. Letters that would destroy not just his reputation, but his family. "Maria doesn't know about these," Marcus said, his voice carrying a deadly calm that reminded Vincent eerily of Bumpy's tone from the night before. She doesn't know that her own brother has been obsessed with her since she was 16. She doesn't know about the private investigators you hired to follow her. She doesn't know about the men you had beaten up just for asking her on dates. The sick truth was finally out in the open. Vincent's protection of his sister hadn't been brotherly love. It had been possession, obsession, a twisted desire that had corrupted every decision he'd made for the past 2 decades. Johnson figured it out, Marcus continued. He's very good at understanding what makes men tick. And what makes you tick, Vincent, is control. Control over territory, control over people, control over your sister. Vincent tried to speak, tried to defend himself, but no words came. How do you defend the indefensible? How do you explain 20 years of psychological manipulation and emotional abuse? Here's what's going to happen, Marcus said, closing the folder with a definitive snap. You're going to write a letter, a confession, not just about your crimes, but about what you really are. What you've really been doing to our family all these years. From his jacket, Marcus pulled out a pen and a sheet of paper. Expensive stationery, the kind Vincent had always insisted on using for important correspondence. And then, Marcus continued, you're going to disappear. Tonight. Forever. Because if you don't, if you're still in this city by tomorrow morning, Johnson won't just destroy you. He'll destroy everyone you've ever pretended to care about. Your legitimate businesses, your political connections, your reputation, all of it will burn. But the real genius of Bumpy's plan wasn't just the evidence or the blackmail. It was psychological. He'd turned Vincent's own family against him by showing them the truth about who he really was. He'd taken the thing Vincent valued most, control, and used it to destroy him. There's a car waiting outside, Marcus said, standing up and straightening his tie. It will take you to the docks. There's a freighter leaving for South America in 2 hours. You'll be on it. Vincent looked at the confession letter, then at his brother-in-law, then at the photographs scattered across his desk. His entire world, his entire identity, reduced to evidence in a folder. What about my money? He asked pathetically. My assets? Marcus smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who had finally seen justice served. Johnson's keeping 20% as payment for services rendered, he said. The other 80% is being donated to journalism schools across the country. Scholarships for young reporters. Kids who want to make the world a better place. The perfect irony. Vincent's dirty money would fund the very kind of investigative journalism that could prevent future Vincent Torinos from rising to power. As Marcus walked toward the door, he paused and looked back one final time. Oh, and Vincent? He said. Johnson wanted me to tell you something. He said to remember that a man's mother is sacred, even a dead man's mother. The door closed behind Marcus with a soft click, leaving Vincent alone with his confession letter and the crushing weight of his own choices. Outside, he could hear the Cadillac's engine still running, waiting to take him away from everything he'd ever known. But what Vincent didn't realize was that Bumpy Johnson wasn't finished with him yet. The South American freighter wasn't an escape route. It was just the first stop on a journey that would teach him exactly what powerlessness felt like. Because a man who would insult another man's mother was a man who had forgotten the most basic rules of human decency. And in Bumpy Johnson's world, some lessons could only be learned the hard way. The game wasn't over, it was just beginning. 6 months later, Vincent Torino thought he had escaped. The freighter had taken him to Buenos Aires, where he'd used his hidden offshore accounts to buy a new identity and a modest apartment in the suburbs. He told himself he was safe. He told himself Bumpy Johnson's reach couldn't extend across continents. He was wrong. The knock came at his door on a Tuesday morning just as he was reading the international edition of the New York Times. 3 sharp raps, deliberate and unhurried. When Vincent opened the door, his blood turned to ice. Standing there, calm as death itself, was Bumpy Johnson. "Hello, Vincent," Bumpy said, adjusting his perfectly tailored suit. "Beautiful morning, isn't it? Mind if I come in?" Vincent's legs nearly gave out beneath him. This was impossible. He was thousands of miles from New York, living under a false name in a country where Bumpy had no connections, no power, no influence. Yet here he stood, looking like he owned the entire city of Buenos Aires. How? Was all Vincent could manage to whisper. Bumpy stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his eyes scanning the sparse apartment with obvious disappointment. You know, Vincent, for a man who stole millions of dollars, you're living rather modestly. I expected something with a little more style. The apartment was indeed modest. 2 bedrooms, basic furniture, the kind of place where a man goes to disappear forever. But Vincent had learned to live with less. After 6 months of looking over his shoulder, luxury had become a liability. The how is simple, Bumpy continued, settling into Vincent's cheap armchair like it was a throne. You see, when a man runs away, he always makes the same mistakes. He goes somewhere familiar, somewhere that reminds him of home. You chose Argentina because your grandmother was Italian, and you thought the culture would feel comfortable. Vincent's mouth went dry. He'd never told anyone about his grandmother's heritage. That information wasn't in any file, wasn't in any record. How could Bumpy possibly know? You also, Bumpy continued, kept some of your old habits. Every Tuesday morning you walk to the same newsstand to buy the international papers. Every Thursday you eat lunch at that little Italian restaurant on Corrientes Avenue. And every Sunday you attend Mass at the cathedral, sitting in the same pew your grandmother used to occupy when she lived here 60 years ago. The revelation hit Vincent like a physical blow. He'd been watched. For 6 months, every move he'd made had been catalogued, every pattern noted, every weakness identified. He wasn't living in exile. He was living in an open-air prison. But Bumpy wasn't finished. From his jacket, he pulled out a thick manila envelope, the same kind of envelope Marcus had carried that terrible morning in New York. Only this one was thicker. Much thicker. Funny thing about running away, Bumpy said, opening the envelope with deliberate slowness. It gives a man time to think, time to reflect on his choices, time to realize exactly what kind of person he really is. The first photograph Bumpy placed on the coffee table showed Vincent at a local brothel. Not unusual for a man in exile, except this particular establishment specialized in very young girls. Girls who looked barely legal, if legal at all. You see, Vincent, Bumpy said, his voice maintaining that same terrifying calm. I thought your problem was just arrogance, just racism, just the casual cruelty of a man who'd forgotten where he came from. But I was wrong. Your problem runs much deeper than that. The second photograph showed Vincent with a local police captain, handing over an envelope full of cash. The third showed him meeting with known human traffickers. The fourth made Vincent's heart stop completely. It was a picture of him with Maria, not his sister Maria, but a 12-year-old girl named Maria who worked in one of the local factories. A girl who'd gone missing 3 weeks ago. A girl whose disappearance had made the local newspapers. You couldn't help yourself, could you? Bumpy asked, his voice now carrying an edge of genuine disgust. 6 months in a new country, a chance to start fresh, to maybe become the man you should have been all along. But instead, you became exactly what I always suspected you were. A predator. Vincent tried to speak, tried to deny it, but the photographs told a story that words could never explain away. He'd thought he was being careful. He'd thought he was being smart. But every move he'd made had been anticipated, documented, preserved for this moment. The beautiful thing about Argentina, Bumpy continued, spreading more photographs across the table, is that they take a very dim view of men who hurt children. The police here, they're not quite as diplomatic as the ones back in New York. When they catch a man like you, well, let's just say, the justice system works a little differently. But the photographs weren't the real revelation. The real revelation came when Bumpy pulled out a small recording device, the same kind he'd used in that back room at Rao's restaurant 6 months ago. 3 days ago, he said, pressing the play button, you had a very interesting conversation with a local businessman about expanding your operations. Vincent's own voice filled the room, discussing prices, ages, shipping routes for human cargo. His words, preserved in crystal clarity, describing plans that would make him rich while destroying the lives of hundreds of innocent children. The thing about recording devices, Bumpy said, turning off the machine, is that they don't lie. They don't exaggerate, they just preserve the truth for posterity. Vincent finally found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. What do you want? Bumpy smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a man who had finally cornered his prey after a very long hunt. Want? He said, standing up and walking to the window. I don't want anything from you, Vincent. You see, this meeting isn't a negotiation. It's not even a confrontation, it's a funeral. Your funeral. Outside the window, Vincent could see them. Black cars surrounding the building, men in dark suits taking positions at every exit. The local police, who'd been paid very well to look the other way for the next hour. You made one fundamental mistake, Bumpy said, turning back to face him. You thought this was about respect. You thought this was about some insult you hurled at my mother in a back room 6 months ago. But it was never about that. Bumpy walked back to his chair and sat down, crossing his legs with the casual confidence of a man who held all the power. This was about justice, he continued. Justice for my nephew, the reporter you had killed. Justice for your sister, who you psychologically tortured for 20 years. Justice for every child you've hurt, every life you've destroyed, every family you've torn apart. The sound of footsteps in the hallway grew louder. Heavy boots, multiple sets, moving with purpose and coordination. The men coming up those stairs, Bumpy said, checking his watch. They're not my men, they're local law enforcement. Very dedicated officers who take child trafficking very seriously. They have warrants, evidence, witnesses, everything they need to ensure you never hurt another innocent person again. The footsteps stopped outside Vincent's door. 3 sharp knocks, just like Bumpy's had been, but somehow infinitely more final. You know what the really beautiful thing is? Bumpy asked, standing up and straightening his tie. My mother always taught me that evil destroys itself eventually. All you have to do is be patient enough to watch it happen. The door exploded inward as the police forced their way in. Vincent found himself surrounded, handcuffed, his rights being read in rapid Spanish while Bumpy watched with the satisfied expression of a man who just finished a very difficult job. But as they dragged Vincent toward the door, Bumpy called out one final time. Oh, Vincent, he said, that terrible smile returning to his face. Remember what I told you about respect being earned? Well, you just learned what happens when you lose it completely. The last thing Vincent saw as they dragged him away was Bumpy Johnson, standing calmly in his ruined apartment, surrounded by the evidence of his crimes, looking like a man who had just balanced the scales of justice with his own hands. The game was over, and Vincent Torino had finally learned that some debts can only be paid in full. But even as the police car pulled away, even as his world collapsed around him for the final time, Vincent couldn't help but wonder, how long had Bumpy been planning this moment? How far did his reach really extend? He was about to find out that Bumpy Johnson's influence went deeper than he'd ever imagined, and his final lesson in respect was only just beginning. 10 years later, Vincent Torino died alone in an Argentine maximum security prison. Not from violence, not from revenge, but from something far more devastating for a man like him: complete irrelevance. The newspapers didn't even run an obituary. The criminal underworld had forgotten his name. He had become exactly what he'd always feared most: nothing. But his story lived on, whispered in back rooms and private clubs across 3 continents. It became the cautionary tale that mothers told their sons, that bosses told their lieutenants, that anyone with power told anyone who might forget the fundamental rules of respect. The morning Vincent died, a single black rose was delivered to his grave. No card, no message, just a flower that told everyone who needed to know that Bumpy Johnson remembered. Even in death, even after a decade of punishment, the debt had been marked as paid in full. Back in Harlem, Bumpy's empire had grown beyond anything anyone could have imagined. But it wasn't built on fear or brutality like Vincent's had been. It was built on something infinitely more powerful: loyalty earned through respect, power exercised with wisdom, and a code of honor that never bent, never broke, never compromised. The story of what happened that night at Rao's restaurant became legend. But the real story, the one that mattered, was what happened afterward. How Bumpy transformed that moment of disrespect into a masterclass in strategic thinking that would influence organized crime for generations. Marcus Torino, Vincent's former brother-in-law, became one of Bumpy's most trusted lieutenants. Not through intimidation or blackmail, but because he'd seen what real leadership looked like. The night Marcus walked into Vincent's study with that folder, he hadn't just been delivering Bumpy's ultimatum, he'd been applying for a new job. "You know what the difference is between a boss and a leader?" Marcus would tell new recruits years later. "A boss demands respect, a leader earns it." Johnson never demanded anything from anyone. He just showed you who he was, and you either respected it or you didn't. But if you didn't, you'd better be prepared for the consequences. The recording from that poker game was never destroyed. Instead, it became part of Bumpy's private collection, a library of lessons about human nature, power, and the price of arrogance. He would sometimes play it for young men who reminded him too much of Vincent Torino, men who thought power meant the right to humiliate others. "Listen to this," he would say, letting them hear Vincent's voice filled with racist hatred and casual cruelty. "This is what happens when a man forgets that respect flows both ways, when he thinks his position gives him the right to tear others down instead of building them up." But the most important lesson wasn't about Vincent at all. It was about the power of patience, the strength of preparation, and the absolute necessity of thinking 10 moves ahead when your enemies are still trying to understand the first one. The truth was, Bumpy had known about Vincent's predatory nature long before that night at Rouse. The insults about his mother weren't the crime. They were just the excuse he'd been waiting for to deliver justice that was already 3 years in the making. The reporter Vincent had killed, Bumpy's nephew, had been gathering evidence about child trafficking networks when he died. His notebooks, recovered from his apartment after his murder, contained detailed documentation about Vincent's activities. Bumpy had simply finished what his nephew started. Every move, every revelation, every moment of Vincent's downfall had been choreographed with the precision of a symphony conductor. The turned photographers, the compromised security, the family betrayal, even the choice of Argentina as Vincent's refuge. All of it had been anticipated and prepared for. The art of war, Bumpy would later tell a young Malcolm X during one of their famous chess games, isn't about fighting battles. It's about making sure your enemy defeats himself. Give a man enough rope and he'll hang himself. Give him enough time and he'll reveal exactly who he really is. The chess analogy was perfect. While Vincent had been playing checkers, making crude moves for immediate gratification, Bumpy had been playing chess, thinking not just moves ahead, but entire games ahead. The network that tracked Vincent to Argentina wasn't built overnight. It was a carefully cultivated web of contacts, favors, and mutual respect that spanned continents. Former CIA operatives who'd grown disgusted with government corruption. International police officers who'd seen too many criminals escape justice on technicalities. Business leaders who understood that real security came from working with honorable men rather than trying to buy them. When Bumpy needed eyes and ears in South America, he didn't hire mercenaries or threaten officials. He simply called in favors from men who respected what he represented: justice without compromise, power without corruption, leadership without ego. The scholarship fund created from Vincent's seized assets became one of the most prestigious journalism programs in the country. Young reporters trained there didn't just learn how to write stories. They learned how to uncover truth, how to speak for the voiceless, how to hold power accountable regardless of the personal cost. Every year on the anniversary of his nephew's death, Bumpy would attend the graduation ceremony. Not as a guest of honor, not seeking recognition, just as a reminder that justice delayed wasn't always justice denied. Sometimes it was just justice prepared properly. The final irony was that Vincent's death made Bumpy more powerful than any violence ever could have. Word spread through the criminal underworld that crossing Bumpy Johnson wasn't just dangerous, it was futile. His reach was too long, his patience too deep, his sense of justice too absolute. But power exercised with wisdom creates something violence never can: respect that transcends fear. Men didn't follow Bumpy because they were afraid of him. They followed him because they wanted to become the kind of men he already was. You want to know the real secret? Bumpy once told a young lawyer who'd asked him how he'd built such lasting influence. Respect isn't something you take. It's something you give. And the more you give, the more you receive. Vincent never understood that. He thought respect was about making others smaller. But real respect is about making others bigger. The lesson echoed through generations. In boardrooms and back alleys, in political offices and prison cells, men would tell the story of Vincent Torino and Bumpy Johnson. How arrogance met wisdom. How cruelty met justice. How a man who forgot the basic rules of human decency learned them the hardest way possible. And in Harlem, in a small apartment above a jazz club, an elderly woman named Margaret Johnson lived comfortably for the rest of her days, never knowing that her son had avenged an insult she'd never even heard. Because in Bumpy's world, a mother's honor was sacred even if she never knew it had been defended. The greatest victories, after all, are the ones that happen in silence. The game was over. Respect had won. And the legend of Bumpy Johnson continued to grow, one act of honor at a time. That's the power of playing the long game. That's the strength of never forgetting where you came from. And that's why even today, old men in Harlem still tell stories about the night someone made the mistake of disrespecting Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson's mother. Some debts can only be paid in full. Some lessons can only be learned the hard way. And some men, once they cross certain lines, discover that redemption isn't always possible. But justice is always possible. You just have to be patient enough to see it through.